afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to another session at the SDG studio. My name is Amy, and I'm originally a journalist from Hong Kong, and now I'm working with a sustainability advisory firm in Copenhagen called Sustainia. So it's my privilege today to moderate a dialogue with Mathew Kurian, an academic officer at the Capacity Development and Governance Unit at the United Nations University, who is an expert in water and climate. So, hi, Mathew. So, in light of World Water Day today, what are the biggest challenge for cities to achieve SDG 6 clean water and sanitation?
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for having me. I think to answer your question in 8 seconds, I think the big opportunity would be to focus on how you finance infrastructure in cities.
Can you elaborate a little bit more, like in...
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I think what I meant is, what I mean by financing infrastructure in cities is if you look at the biggest areas where there's urbanization today, where there's growth in population, it is not so much in the big cities like Sao Paulo or Accra that the fastest rates of urbanization are taking place. On the contrary, the fastest rates of urbanization are happening in smaller cities. Not so much Beijing, but maybe smaller cities is where you get the fastest rates of growth. But the fastest rates of growth are also accompanied by very low coverage in terms of infrastructure. So it's these cities that are growing the fastest, but they don't have infrastructure for water supply. They don't have infrastructure to manage their waste or wastewater. So I think when I talk about financing infrastructure, it's these kinds of opportunities that we should be targeting because they make economic sense, but they also make a lot of environmental sense because this is where a lot of people earn their livelihoods. This is where a lot of people's public health and health is affected. So I think investing in secondary towns, smaller towns, where there's high levels of economic growth and potential to improve the environment, those are the areas we should be focusing on in terms of financing infrastructure.
Indeed. I mean, when there's a risk, there's always an opportunity. So do you have a success story to share for cities who have, like, invest in, like, infrastructure for clean water and better wastewater management?
Right. I think I can share an example that my colleague Rachel Schindler has been very instrumental in getting known within the UNU framework, within the UNU family. And if you Google UNU, United Nations University, there is what is known as the SDG Explorer, right? It's a very interesting website where you get to see the most prominent and the most interesting UNU projects online. So if you Google UNU Explorer right now, you'll notice there's one project there which is called the Wastewater Reuse Effectiveness Index. And this is a project that's almost 3 years in the works. It's involved UNU in Dresden, UNU-FLORES, working very closely with UN Habitat, which is the UN agency that's responsible for human settlements. And we've been working with UN Habitat in Geneva for the last 3 years on SDG 6.3. So for those of you who are experts, SDG 6.3 focuses on reuse of wastewater in an urban setting. And I think the important lesson that we can learn from this is that research is only maybe 1/4 of the real success of this story. But I think the more important part is how you actually work with people who are not scientists and how you can communicate with people who are not scientists, because not all officers in the UN system understand what scientists say. So I think that's the other part of the story. How do you communicate with UN officers who are not specialists? The more important success of this particular project is how do your communications team in UNU or even in the UN system how can they use what you've generated, use your example, and actually communicate it in language that you and I can understand. So journalists, people who don't have a PhD, people on the street, people who pay taxes, people who go to SDG events like this, who don't know anything about wastewater reuse. How can you effectively communicate that message in 8 seconds? I think that is the bigger success of this example, how we've been able to work with communications teams within UNU, how we've been able to work with UN agencies like UN Habitat, and of course, partly some interesting research that's actually made this project really successful. So I think that would be one example that I can share with you. And I would encourage all of you who are interested in more information to get on SDG Explorer, where you'll see other examples of UNU success stories, of which this is just one of them. Okay.
Just to follow up with what you've just said, do you have any quick tips for how we can communicate more effectively to people who don't, who are not like experts, like your personal tips?
I think one tip that I found to be very successful and very effective is to actually ask questions and to never pretend that you know all the answers because you're an academic officer, but to ask questions from people and to try and understand why they don't understand what you're saying, which might be so true. You know, it might be backed by data, it might be backed by evidence and case studies, but if your communications team cannot understand what you're saying, then I don't think you can consider yourself or your project to be successful, because it's only when you can communicate effectively that you can actually make your project successful. So I think the most important tip is to have the humility to ask, why don't you understand what I'm saying? And then to continuously work on improving your message so that you can get to the point where everybody can understand you. And until you get to that point, I don't think you are successful from the point of view of the SDGs and making the SDGs work for everyone. So that would be my tip. Okay.
Thank you so much. And as a journalist, I cannot agree more with you on that. So this is the end of this session of SDG Studio. Thank you, Mathew, again for sharing with us water insights. So I'll stay tuned for the next session.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy.